So welcome to the tier list video, everybody. If this is your first one, this is based off the current meta as I see it, and specifically I'm going to be drawing on a lot of what we saw in the Frostbyte Cup. S tier weapons I consider to be a weapon that significantly influenced the current meta. A tier weapons are just really solid weapons, really good for their cooldown, usually are good on their own without too many combo pieces. B tier weapons are still very good. They don't really stand on their own as well as other weapons in S and A tier. C tier weapons, not very good, aren't gonna see much use, and are also gonna require a lot of setup. D tier in this case is Helix tier. Sorry, it's not Helix tier anymore. It is now Vector tier. D tier weapons you really just shouldn't run. They are not good for their cooldown, not great weapons in the current meta. Thing that I'll be talking about that I ended up talking about in a lot of the other tier lists that I never really went over. The concept of duration. This isn't an actual stat. This is something that I use when I think about these weapons. A weapon's duration is its cooldown versus how long you actually use the weapon. Wildcat's gonna be going up into S tier, because a Wildcat is a 3-second weapon that you can use for almost 15 seconds and get full effectiveness out of. You may not have even realized it, but during the Frostbyte tournament, this was run on almost every single build. It's just so much value for its cooldown. It can be cycled almost non-stop just to continuously apply pressure. This weapon doesn't necessarily do very high damage, but does very steady damage. And while we're here in the S tier, Tether's going up into S tier. You may be confused. You may be saying, Oolong, I thought you said that S and A tier were mostly reserved for weapons that didn't require much setup. Tether just turns a lot of already great builds into fantastic builds. And what's happened is that a lot of the weapons that it specifically buffs, the Raptor Ellipse, which I am including as a Tether weapon here, the Raptor, the Hammer, even some other weapons that now activate off of the tether. The AvalancheNade, the Straight Viper, Raptor Ellipse being run, no tether in sight. You add a tether on and now all of a sudden that becomes lethal. It's just how flexible a build now you can make with the tether on it. And we haven't even brought in the Wildcat, sitting at 5 seconds, but you're running so many other low cooldown weapons. The duration of it that you do end up getting is perfectly fine. All right, what weapon are we going with next? Let's go to the shields. Bring all 3 of these shields over. Aegis Shield, going into A. Now, A stands for Aegis Shield. The changes that they made to this weapon in the last patch increased its health, decreased its duration, and decreased its size. The size change is the biggest nerf to this weapon that it's received yet. That being said, this is still the best shield to be using against nades, against most bullet spam. The only spots where it loses are against lasers and other sustained bullets. Overall, a great weapon, low cooldown, 3 seconds. So yeah, so let's talk about B for Bunker. Bunker going really at like very high B tier, very low A tier. It's very conditional depending on the build you're playing against, but it's never not effective, especially as other shield options have sort of gone out the window. Its cooldown is pretty big, sitting at 8 seconds. It stays up for a while, long enough that it does outlast its overall cooldown. Probably would be an A tier, but I love B for Bunker. And lastly, let's talk about Cortex Shield. Now we really do get the memes because C is for Cortex Shield. A for Aegis, B for Bunker, C for Cortex. 5 seconds is just too much for this shield, especially because most of the things you're looking out for nowadays are nades and short bursts of a lot of bullets. As shields overall have become more costly, I don't see 5 seconds being worth it on the shield. Oh, I'm sorry, the 6 seconds. I didn't realize this in the last patch. They did make it slightly smaller. They increased the cooldown to 6 seconds. They decreased the health and they increased the duration to 3 seconds? Okay, great. So you're no longer comparing this to a swarm. You're now comparing it to a Hammer Ellipse. I'm leaving it at C tier for the memes. But this at this point is borderline D tier. Placebo is better than Cortex. Nova gonna go actually at B tier behind the Bunker. Nova's a great defensive option. You get the big meaty orbs, 3 of the big meaty boys. Each one of those has 65 health on them. That's a lot of health that it can suck up, and especially against the Hammer Ellipse, the Wildcat, a low collision and a lot of projectiles. Nova does great against all of those options. The downside with Nova is how easily countered it is. If your opponent's running things that do heavily counter it, even just a hammer, you're not going to be having a fun time. The bunker is a better defensive option. I feel like the Nova is more flexible than the bunker ends up being. Going into B tier, let's talk about the Vandal. I've had a change of heart on the Vandal, folks. The Vandal is now going into A tier. The Vandal pre-quick draw patch was a very niche weapon against Nova, bunker, and excessive amounts of nades. The meta has now shifted towards a lot of weapons that the Vandal does really well up against. The thing that made it shift up to A tier was the recent changes to the blind mechanic. This is the only weapon that still has the old blind mechanic, where it actually does blind a certain area around your opponent's face. And because of that, we saw a lot of people in the most recent tournament, after taking out their 1 to 2 projectiles, using it to blind their opponent while they threw out their nades. It's still a very situational weapon by definition. It does no damage. Going up into A tier, don't listen to Wesso, he is bad at the game. Let's talk about the Frostbyte itself next. After the recent changes, is gonna go into B tier. It is worth knowing that no matter what, both the Frostbyte and the Raptor are going to be good on almost every single build because they both have the lowest cooldown in the game. Frostbyte is a very, no pun intended, hit or miss weapon. You either have the setup for it and you land it and it does 15 damage and it does a blind, and great, 15 damage on a 2-second weapon is fantastic. But a lot of the times this ends up going wide, or more commonly ends up colliding with a bullet in the air or drop blocked, because you can drop block this thing too. It used to be A tier because even then it would still partially blind, but now with the changes to the blind mechanic that have been made, not nearly at the spot where it was before. And then the last one of the blinding weapons is the Tundra. It's garbage. Well, it's not garbage. It was recently introduced in this update. It's 6 seconds, it has 3 shots. Each one of those shots is doing 25 damage, and you have to hold down the trigger for, I think it's like 1.5 seconds, 2 seconds. I would say the biggest issue for the Tundra is actually its primary mechanic. The fact that it takes an extra 1.5 seconds to fire. In Blaston, that's almost too much time. And the projectiles aren't very fast. They also have surprisingly low both collision and health. For a 6-second cooldown, you could be running this, or you could be running a Hammer Ellipse. And even compared to the Nova Hurricane, at least when I hit the Nova Hurricane, it comes out right as I hit it, which is way more useful for getting people off the front of their platform, rather than something like this where it has to charge up. Viper's gonna go up into B tier for me. Straight Viper. 5 seconds, each shot doing 30 damage a hit. The reload time made this one feel significantly different from the Viper Ellipse. It's still very hard to hit if you don't have the setup for it. And the fact that it has a higher reload rate actually makes it really effective once you do have the setup for it. Good example of how this can be used to full effectiveness is in 2-4's build. 2 nades as setup, and then he goes in with a bunch of high damage but straight weapons. Especially if you hide it in a bunch of other projectiles, it can be really hard to see coming when you're worrying about a whole bunch of other stuff. The other thing I want to talk about with this weapon is the fact that you can use it to snipe down nades. So it has that utility too. The fact that its reload speed is much higher than the Viper Ellipse makes it a much more appealing option if you're looking for more rapid all-at-once gameplay. And since we're here talking about the Viper, let's talk about the Viper Ellipse going up into A tier. This weapon is at this point a staple on a lot of different people's builds. You know the people. I don't even have to say the people's names. That's the power of this weapon. The curve adds a bunch of depth to its gameplay, and only sacrificing an additional second on the cooldown, a great weapon, high DPS, any weapon that's doing, 30 damage is great just on the damage alone. What else is there to say about this weapon? If you've been on the receiving end of a great player using this weapon, you already know how good it is. I will say that drop blocking has become a defense against this. It's going up in A tier. Next weapon we're going to talk about is the Hammer Ellipse. So you frequently see these two run together, lay down a whole bunch of layers of the Hammer Ellipse, and then you go in with the Viper Ellipse, deal some damage while they're so distracted with all the other bullets This is overall just a continuously great weapon. They've tried to nerf it like 5 times now, but it's still just a great weapon for consistency's sake. Even without other weapons being brought into play, if you just were to use the Hammer Ellipse, you'd probably get some solid damage done on your opponent. Now, a lot of players are confused, hey, how the fuck do I get around this? You want to put pressure on your opponent. You want to make sure that they don't have the placement on the front of their play area that they need to be able to put down the clamps in the positions that they're going to put them down in. So let's put the last Ellipse weapon in its place. Raptor Ellipse also going up into S tier. I went on a bit of a soul-searching quest with the Raptor Ellipse, really trying to figure out whether it was a bad weapon or if I just didn't have enough practice with it. And now I'm like, I hate this weapon. I don't want to be using this weapon, and yet it still keeps winning me games. If you know how to use the curve, even a tiny curve can mean the difference between hitting your opponent or, having them just stand off to the side as the bullets pass over by them. The acceleration on the curve is actually quite large and can be very deceiving for players who aren't used to it. So speaking of which, we talked a lot about the Raptor. Let's place it, shall we? We're gonna put it right next to the Snowball. Again, both the Raptor and the Frostbite are always gonna be useful. For those of you who don't know, builds in Blaston actually have a cooldown cap. Because of that, you always wanna make sure that your builds are below 27 seconds. Usually the Frostbite and the Raptor are helping me get there. Raptor though, compared to the Frostbite, doing less damage, but its use is more utility than strict damage. There's not really much else to say about it. It does great collision damage. It does great normal damage. I don't feel like you could get away with just a Raptor like you can, honestly, with a Raptor Ellipse. Still a very solid weapon choice, even if it does need that little bit of additional setup. Let's talk about the lowest cooldown grenade. The MajesticNade is going solidly into C tier. I love the MajesticNade, and really the main weakness of the MajesticNade is that you need to get it so close to your opponent to be effective, but it only goes a very short distance. If you don't get it close to your opponent, this thing is actually completely useless to you. And because of that requirement, decent players are going to be very aware. They're going to grab that and maybe not have a chance to throw it back at you, but at least be able to counter it. Going into C tier, I would love to see this nade get some love. Let's go into the nades. Wabam, waboom, wazoo, and wazoo. So I'm going to talk about all of these at once. Grenades are very good right now. They're frequently hazards, and they can be positioned behind your opponent or above your opponent. Anything that gets your opponent to look away from straight at you is going to be advantageous for you, both because they're going to be taking their eyes off the ball, but also because a lot of people's setups are not meant to be turning around and looking up. Probably the one that is most used is the AvalancheNade. 4-second cooldown, fires off little beam cages where if they hit your opponent, they do consistent damage over time, and it sort of sets up a hazard. People probably expected me to put this into S tier. I don't feel like this is an S tier weapon. If you hit with this and it sets up the hazards, then great, and you've probably done already a ton of damage, even if 1 or 2 of them are hitting. But really, people have learned how to play around the AvalancheNade, specifically on how to duck underneath its cone of fire, and if it misses, then it just kind of doesn't do anything. The NovaNade's in the same spot. It's a much wider area that lasts for a little bit longer. This one's a lot more risky at 5 seconds, but has more of an immediate effect on your opponent. That's recent. NovaNade is a lot weaker to the Vandal. Its nade is weak to the Vandal, or the Nova itself can be popped by the Vandal. With how much the Vandal gets run nowadays, it is risky to be running it. Going into B tier with that, so these 2 nades are actually much more consistent. The LanceNade just fires off a beam that holds its position over a period of multiple seconds. The great thing about the LanceNade is that you don't need to be anywhere near your opponent to hit them. And the fact that it lasts over several seconds means that it's a consistent hazard that you can use to set up for other things. This is just as good as the Lance in my eyes because of the ability for you to position it at different angles around your opponent. And then the HammerNade, I really love the buff that they gave to the HammerNade. I still feel like it's in B tier. HammerNade is sort of an equivalent to the Hammer and the Hammer Ellipse. It does really, really consistent chip damage and doesn't need to really be placed that close to your opponent in order for it to be useful. Actually, the max damage that it can inflict is bonkers. It can't actually one-hit your opponent. Compared to the NovaNade, it It hits more consistently, but it does less damage when it hits. Lance is also going up into A tier. I made this claim like 3 patches back, but I was very incorrect about it. The main weakness of the Lance before was its reload time. They decreased the reload speed from 2 seconds to 1 second. It's a great, simple to use hazard that can be set up in a wide variety of different ways. It's actually a great setup for nades. This is a great weapon that I've started using for the cooldown, for a 4-second cooldown especially, while we're talking about hazard. Well, and we need to talk about the Lance R. The turning point for me with the Lance R was when, I think it was one of the rounds up against Woody. Shermie threw out a Lance R positioned like a triangle in the center of Woody's platform. Woody actually could not get out of the way of it, but it really like clicked to me. It now can successfully hold its own on its own. They changed the reload time from 1 second to 0.5 seconds, increased the duration of each one of the beams up by 1 second, and they reduced the cost from 10 seconds to 9 seconds. It's really the 9-second cooldown that still puts it into B tier. 9 seconds is a hard ask, especially considering that there are so many other options that don't cost nearly that much. So yep, gonna go into B tier. Great as a combination with the Lance. Either one of these though can be used on their own to great effect. Let's talk about B is for Hurricane. Hurricane got a pretty big nerf. They had changed the reload time on this to match the Wildcat, which made it great as both a defensive and an offensive option. Last patch, it was sort of in an uncertain spot. They recently buffed it again. They changed the reload time down from 0.5 second to 0.3 seconds. They decreased the speed of the projectiles. And it's funny, they actually put here more useful used as intended. This is now a great option just firing up. We saw a lot of people basically using the Hurricane as soon as it came off of cooldown and doing a lot of damage just from that alone. I think that once people get used to this weapon again, it'll start to become less run, especially considering that something like the Raptor at 2 seconds can trade with it. Overall, I like the spot that it's in. Let's talk about the swarms. Actually, hammer first. Hammer first, then swarm. The hammer, 3-second weapon. It's only got 2 shots, but each one of those shots is putting out a lot of smaller pellets. It does surprisingly good in any situations where you need a lot of condensed collision. Its downsides are that it isn't really great when used offensively. Without additional hazards, it isn't nearly as useful. Now we can talk about the swarm. The swarm's also gonna go up into B tier. I recently was playing around with the swarm a bit. The tier 3 shot definitely got solid nerfs. The main strategy in the quick draw update, charge up a tier 3, put it on the front of your opponent's podium, and either they run into it and it does all of its damage at once, or it fires off and hopefully you've caught your opponent shooting through the black hole with pretty much anything. Eliminates that strategy. That being said, the tier 1 and the tier 2 shots are still fairly good. It's mostly used as a hybrid hazard and offensive weapon. It's fairly easily counterable. B tier is where that's gonna be going. We're getting into the weeds of it now, folks. And let's talk about new Helix first. Significantly being improved from a D tier to a C tier, Helix fans rejoice. Helix has had a complicated history. It was originally a super overpowered weapon, and then they nerfed it, and then they nerfed it again. And then recently, they made the change away from 2 projectiles per shot to 3. And I feel like it was an improvement. Can only barely take it out with a 2-second Raptor. But they also reduced the damage from 25 to 10 damage a shot. The same as the Hurricane. But this is now on a 7-second cooldown. I really feel like this should have a 3rd shot to put it directly in line with the Nova, which shares the same cooldown. And the damage is pretty underwhelming. As of right now, it's still very underwhelming for the cooldown. If you want to run this, just run a normal Nova. I think they're really trying to figure out where this is in the overall lineup. I think that they're taking steps in the right direction. And we're just gonna cap off the Nova family at this point. Nova Hurricane is also going into C tier. It's very good, both defensively when you fire it off into the air, but also really good offensively. The bullets, when they come out, they get a very brief boost of speed, and that makes it so that if someone's sitting at the front of their podium, you could shoot through their projectiles and hit their hand and do a quick 25 damage before getting the heck out of there. As far as using it like the Hurricane, if you're gonna be firing it up as a consistent hazard, use that. The Nova Hurricane's a bit more flexible when it comes to using it offensively. It feels great to be able to collide with a couple of your opponent's bullets and either get their hand or just force them to retreat back. And the last one that's not going into D tier, the Super Majestic. Super Majestic is one of those weapons that I always feel like other people are using better than me. They'll fire into the center of my play area and I'll be like teetering on the edge trying to get around it. And then I end up using it and it's not getting close to my opponent. I feel like this is a very common experience. Either the positioning is great and you follow it up with other great things, or they have all the room in the world. And in that case, you've wasted a 10-second cooldown weapon, which means that this is now the highest cooldown in the game at 10 seconds. It's a huge cost for what you end up getting out of it. You could have any of these other weapons. Every single other weapon is going to be a shorter cooldown. We're getting into the last two weapons. We already knew that both these weapons were ending up in D tier. Instead of just roasting them, I'm going to say what I feel like is the major issue with each one of these weapons, and also how I would change these weapons. Let's start with the Vector. Vector, oh, how the mighty have fallen. Damage decreased to 6, the speed decreased, and it really was the speed in my eyes. It used to be very fast right off the bat, and now your opponent gets so much foresight as to where your projectiles are going, and it costs a second more, and if it does hit, it does 2 less damage a hit. Why would you run this over the Wildcat? Yeah, the rebound effect was great in a meta that focused specifically on doing chip damage over time, but why do chip damage over time when you could just do insane amounts of damage all at once with a combo build? What would I change to make this better? Definitely increase the speed to where it was before. Put the speed at the same level as the Wildcat. I also think that this weapon should speed up each time that it hits a wall, which could lead to some really cool combos. Even going like side to side and having it speed up before going out and hitting your opponent would be really cool. This was starting to be in a really interesting spot, especially with people using corner shots and off the ceiling shots. Now no one uses it, so you know, hey, encourage your players to do trick shots and maybe increase the ammo a little bit. That's just me. And lastly, the Majestic. The Majestic's main issue is twofold. Its cooldown and its hitbox. The cooldown on this is 6 seconds. For an additional second, you could get a Nova that has collision and has a whole other bullet in the chamber. But Dr. Oolong, the lack of collision is why I run the Majestic, said no one fucking ever. Even with that, the hitbox on this, I believe, is just broken. If you hit the very corner of a Majestic cage, it doesn't do damage, which doesn't line up with how the other Majestics work. As a last note, the duration of the beam cages could be a lot more. It always feels like it gets halfway and then it like disappears out of nowhere. What I would do is I would make sure that the hitboxes are working, and then I would increase the duration on the beam cages. And if we want to keep consistency, maybe have the beam cages go out a certain distance and then stop, because it's the only Majestic that does that as well. That one I think is really going to need a rework, like the Helix has been starting to get recently. For the time being, it's going to be in D tier. So yeah, overall, a lot more things in A and B tier after the past 2 patches, which is good. I'd rather have more weapons above average than have a bunch of weapons below average. Just buff the Tundra a little bit so it actually sees use. Increase the collision on these. And make sure to nerf the Vandal into the ground. Give the Vandal 4 shots. Just see what happens. You shouldn't be able to take out a whole Nova and my 2 nades that I'm running on my build. But hey, maybe that's just as a guy who runs Nova and 2 nades on my build. But this is going to be my tier list. Feel free to argue about it at the official Blaston Discord. Speaking of Discords, if you like me and you like the things that I do, if you haven't joined the Discord yet, we run events and fight nights. Go ahead, join the Discord. That's the main point of contact with me and all of the events that I do. And yeah, that's gonna be it. So thank you all for joining. I have been Dr. Oolong, and just remember, a doctor a day keeps the assholes away. Everybody have a good night, and I will talk to you later.